Alrighty, we'll get started. Welcome everybody for joining. Today will be the introduction session to the OneClickLCA summer school. So during this session, we'll talk mostly about what we'll actually be talking about during the session, what we aim to teach you, what you'll be learning, yeah, everything basically related to that. The sessions will be recorded as well. So after the session, the next day, the recording will be available to you guys. You'll be able to download it. My name is Steven. I'm the Customer Success Manager at OneClickLCA. So I'll be running some of the sessions with you, and some of my colleagues will be doing some of the sessions as well. I'll go to the next slide. How do I do this? So we have a couple of rules during this summer school. Please keep your microphones muted. They should be on mute by default. If you have some questions about the software, about whatever we're talking about, maybe some methodology, please use the Q&A section in Zoom. So we also have the chat, but the chat is a bit difficult to moderate. So if you can use the Q&A section, you'll get an answer from one of the moderators right away. There will also be a Q&A section after every session. So the goal is that these sessions run about 1.5 hours. After that, there will be about a 30-minute Q&A section where I will also answer some questions. But throughout the session, some of the moderators will be glad to help you. Today, we have 4 moderators present, all from OneClickLCA. We have Sean and Antti, who are customer success specialists. Then we have Vasilis, who is one of our business developers, and we have Graham, who's also one of our CS specialists. As I also note in the slide here, the recordings and slides and any other materials will always be available the next day. So you can always look it back at that moment. Today will be just the summer school overview we start with, basically what we'll be doing here. After that will be a short introduction to OneClickLCA. So who are we? Why are we doing this? We'll talk shortly about climate change and construction. So why is this relevant? We'll talk about the legislation and standards which will be relevant, and a small business case for building sustainability. And we'll also talk about some of the homework. So why do we do a Building LCA summer school? Well, the idea of the summer school started because basically in our circles and our network, we got the signals that there are just not enough people who can do Building LCA. There might not be enough people who have studied this, or might be too difficult to get into it. So basically this course is aimed at students or fresh graduates or people in their early careers who want to do Building LCA or carbon studies, who want to get experience in how to do this, and specifically, of course, with OneClickLCA, our software. So that is what we will be trying to teach you. So basically, we'll talk about why Building LCA, why carbon studies, how you can do this with OneClickLCA, and everything which is related to that. So yeah, pretty much everything. So what you'll learn here is, first of all, we have to understand the impact of the construction sector on the environment. Some of you may already know it, or some of you it might be completely new. We need to know why we need to do building sustainability, and also what kind of regulations are driving the sustainability. We also need to know, of course, about the core concept of life cycle assessment. What kind of life cycle stages are there? The environmental impact assessment. What kind of data do we actually need to do this kind of assessments? And of course, we also would need a software training. So during the first session, I will give a software training on OneClickLCA, so how you can actually do these assessments yourself. We'll also learn how to automate data imports, because life cycle assessment itself can be quite a long process if you don't use any type of automation for it. And it can be made much, much quicker if we have, for example, a Revit model, or we have cost plans or anything like that. So I think during session 7, one of my colleagues, Marios, will be talking about that, and he'll show you different types of plugins, how you run import and whatnot. We'll also do an overview of different types of certifications. So if you're in one country, the certifications will be very different probably from another. And of course, we have some certifications which are spanning globally, like BREEAM or LEED or these kind of things. So we'll talk about those specific ones. We'll give an overview of all the sessions. And then there's also a couple of optional sessions, sessions 11 to 14, which really talk about specific schemes. So every day, or basically every weekday, we have these sessions from 4 p.m. ET, or it might be EST. I've made a small mistake there, but basically 4 p.m. Helsinki time. So you can quickly check what time is this for you. All of these sessions will be 90 minutes, and with about a 30-minute Q&A section after that. So we've divided this in 4 modules. We first of all have the introduction to construction sustainability in OneClickLCA. So part of that will be done today. We'll have measuring impacts, construction materials, methods, and optimization. Then we'll take a look at the automating of data import and the certification overview. And we'll also have optional specific certification sessions. Throughout the course, or actually from the third session on, you'll have access to a free training license. And in the first session, I'll also explain how you can get access to it. As I mentioned earlier, all of the training materials like the slides and the recordings, that will be all made available the next day of each session. There will also be 6 homework assignments. They are not mandatory, but I do recommend you to do them. They're not too difficult, but they will get you quite a good insight in why you're doing this, how it's relevant, and it will basically help what you're learning here if you're doing some research in that. In the 10th session, we'll have a 40 multiple choice question exam. During this exam, you'll have questions from all the last sessions. So basically the sessions 1 to 8. Session 9 is a recap, and then we'll have the exam. If you pass it, it says a 90% pass rate, you get a certificate of attendance for this summer school course as well. Then who are our hosts throughout this summer school? So of course, me, Steven, I'll be running sessions 1 to 4 and then 6 to 10. We have session 5 will be done by our CEO, Panu. Then we'll have one session on imports done by Mario Sikos, who's one of my colleagues who is an LCA consultant. We'll have 2 of the optional sessions on brand and lead done by Joanna Jarvinen. She's one of our business development managers. We'll have Aurelia do a session on the French schemes. She's also one of our business development managers. And then we have Fernando, who will do one session on the Nordic schemes. These are Nordic business developer. So as we said, this summer school is made up of 4 modules. So the first one, it will be really an introduction to everything. So an introduction to the software, to the fundamentals of LCA, EPDs, and the software training. Software 2 focuses more on how you measure impacts, what kind of materials are there that you can measure with, and how do you optimize your results to basically reach the desired targets or goals. Module 3 then goes a bit further. So then we talk about how we can automate data to make LCA even faster. We'll talk about different types of certifications we have there and how you can get credits for those. After that module 3, there's the exam at session 10. And then in module 4, we have some optional sessions. So the module 4 is not required to pass the exam, but if you're active in one of those countries which is covered by those modules, by the certification we're talking about, I would recommend to join them because they can be very useful. So then session 1, which is basically today. Today we'll be talking about measuring construction impacts. We'll be looking at the utilization of carbon footprints in construction projects. We'll be looking at how we can reduce emissions in practical projects, how we actually calculate, and then there will be the homework assignment plus this 30-minute Q&A session. During session 2, we'll be going a step further, a bit more into the theory. So we'll talk about life cycle assessment and data. So what kind of life cycle assessment or life cycle stages are there? How do we record them? What kind of assessment methods are there? And what kind of impact indicators? We'll talk about some core LCA concepts. We'll talk about EPDs, which are environmental product declarations, program operators, database structure, and again, there's a homework assignment plus a Q&A session afterwards. Then we have the session 3, and this is the software training. So I'll first teach you how to use the software using the license key you'll be getting. I'll also give you access to the license key, so you'll be able to access OneClickLCA for the period of the summer school, basically. And there will be some homework where you have to do some certain checks using the software. During session 4, when you have gotten to know the software a bit, we'll be looking at how can we actually measure things. So how are we measuring the carbon footprint in construction projects? How are we actually reducing our numbers? And how does it kind of work in practice of calculating everything? Plus, there will be another homework assignment, which is kind of focused on how do you reduce your emissions. Then during session 5, which will be hosted by our CEO, I'm not doing this session, he will be talking about what are the most commonly used construction materials, what are the most commonly used construction methods. So we'll be looking at different types of methods for construction, and how do you actually match these construction materials to the OneClickLCA database. So this will also be a very useful session. Now, during session 6, I will give you a demo of our early phase tool called Carbon Designer. So Carbon Designer is really useful to get an instant understanding of the possible emissions you can have when you don't have too much data available yet. We'll also be talking more about calculating. We'll be talking more about interpreting the results. So if you get a bunch of numbers, what do they actually mean? Which of them are important? What would you have to use towards clients and these kind of things? How do we actually optimize our results? And then there will also be a Q&A session. Then we have session 7. This will be done by one of my colleagues, Marius, and he will be talking mostly about integration of data through automated methods. So he'll be giving you an overview of all the different types of plugins we have. I think at the moment we support 14 or 15. He will also show some of these plugins, like our Revit plugin, Rhino plugin, Grasshopper plugin. I'll run through 2 exports. So our imports, my bad. So we do an Excel import and a Revit import. And there will also be a mandatory homework assignment where you have to try to do this kind of import yourself. And there will, of course, also be a Q&A session. During session 8, we'll really look at what kind of LCA credits are out there. So what kind of LCA credits are out there? What are the requirements for the most popular building certification schemes? And how can you actually use OneClickLCA to help with those? So I'll give you an overview of basically everything that's out there which matters, how we can use OneClickLCA to get certain credits, and I'll also give you some examples of how this could be done with our software. During session 9, this will be mostly just a recap. We'll talk about everything which happened from session 1 to 8, and this is kind of to prepare you for the exam. So if you have attended these sessions or you have rewatched the recordings or whatnot, there should be no issue to pass the exam, but you of course have to take note of what's happening. During session 10, we have the actual exam. So it will be a 40 multiple choice question exam with a pass rate of 90%. If you pass it, you will get a certificate of attendance for this summer school. Basically, it's as easy as that. Then we have 4 of those optional sessions. And as I said, like if you're working in any of these countries, or maybe you're looking at pursuing a job related to some of these certifications, I definitely recommend to join these sessions, because I will not be covering these tools very much in depth, but throughout these sessions we will. So in session 11, the target area is kind of the United Kingdom. So one of my colleagues, Joanna, she'll be talking about BREM UK, RICS, and GLA, which are 2 of the most commonly done LCA or carbon studies in the United Kingdom. During session 12, we'll talk about BREAM International and LEED. And this is pretty much important for anybody who wants to work in building LCA, because this is done in pretty much any country. So BREAM is officially, of course, coming from the UK, but it's done everywhere in the world. And LEED is officially a US certification scheme made by the US GBC, but it's also practiced all around the world. So these are by far the 2 most popular certifications. And just knowing about how you can actually do an assessment for these tools can really benefit you. Session 13 will be mostly about the French regulations. So why do we specifically put French regulations here? Because in France, it will be mandatory to do LCA. So if you're working in France, or maybe you're in surrounding countries and you're looking at maybe specializing in any of these certifications, it's definitely useful to join. Yeah, as I said, it will be mandatory to do LCA for any building in France. So it's quite important driver for doing this kind of stuff. Then session 4 is specifically related to the Nordics. So we'll talk about 3 certification schemes here, which are basically the 3 most popular in the Nordics. So with the Swedish Klimatdeklaration, obviously important if you're in Sweden or if you're any of the neighboring countries who are doing assessments for Swedish clients. We'll be doing NS 3720, which is the Norwegian standard, which is mandatory in Norway. And we do the YM method, which is the Finnish standard. So if you're in the Nordics and you want to know more about these schemes, definitely join this session as well. So then now I'll give you a short introduction to OneClickLCA. Our software offers different type or software or platform offers different types of modules to decarbonize the global construction industry. Our company was founded in 2001, so quite a long time ago. So we've been in this business for quite a while. And we basically developed an easy-to-use and automated software to decarbonize the construction industry. Our company previously was called Bionova, but we made the name switch to be more in line with our software brand, which is of course OneClickLCA. We do offer different types of modules. So the ones we'll be mostly talking about in the summer school are the building LCA part. So basically OneClickLCA for construction. We also have EPD generators, which are for product LCA, mostly focused on doing product LCA for building materials like concrete, steel, or any building material you can think of really. We do also offer CSR or GSE reporting for investors and corporations. And we have, of course, custom solutions. Plus we have a free tool, which is OneClickLCA Planetary. Basically, we do almost everything in the realm of the construction industry or construction sustainability. So we offer, of course, the software, but we also do consulting projects. We do trainings, verifications, advice. We are pretty much in any market where LCA matters. So we can see it's Europe, North America, Asia Pacific, Middle East. We even have some clients on the African continent, but there isn't a lot of LCA done there as of today. We have a staff of about 60 right now, I think. So we're growing quite quick. And we invest about a third of our revenue in research and development. We have written a couple of quite high impact reports, the latest being one for the World Bank Sustainable Investment. And you can see a couple on this slide also. For example, the embodied carbon review. In that case, we looked at pretty much any scheme around the world which looks at embodied carbon and rated them against each other as well. We have written some policies for the CNCA, the Carbon Neutral City Alliance, and we have also written some policies for governments and whatnot. So there's quite a lot of these kind of things. If you go to our website, oneclicklca.com, and you go to the resources tab, you'll also be able to find these if it's interesting for you. So our software is used in more than 100 countries, probably 110 by now or something like that. We support over 40 certifications, so virtually everything that matters in the world. Our database is by far the largest in the world. Currently has over 100,000 data sets. I think it's currently 120,000 if I'm not mistaken. We currently have 15 integrations, I think. And as I said, we've been around for a while already. So how do we decarbonize the global construction industry? Well, this summer school focuses on our building side. So really the building design and construction. So building LCA, carbon studies. But of course, there's much more in this realm of construction. We also do infrastructure LCA. So doing LCA for bridges or anything like this, or city planning. We do product LCA, of course, and we do GSE or CSR tracking, where you record all the emissions for a company or organization over a year or something like this. We have a quite global offering. So there is a lot of tools on the market which do one or two things of what we are doing, but we're doing pretty much everything. So there's not a single tool which really comes close to what we're doing. And this also gives us a quite good position in the market. We are basically connecting the entire industry with each other. So our clients, one moment. So our clients are mostly engineers, architects, manufacturers, builders, investors, and institutions. And our platform also allows everybody to send data towards each other. So an engineer or architect, if they've done a study, they could share it with one of the consultants, which could send it to one of the investors who are gathering the portfolio there. Manufacturers who are doing data can send it directly to the consultants who need it. So there's a lot of cooperation within the platform, within the different modules with each other. Our software is quite easy to use compared to traditional LCA. We have a variety of different type of tools. So not just LCA, but for example, also circularity assessment, lifecycle costing. We integrate to quite a lot of different tools. So I would say most commonly used tools we integrate to. Our database, as I already said, it's one of the biggest in the world. It's global data we integrate. We have different types of integrations for different types of stages where it matters. So if you're in really early phase and you don't have that much data yet, we, for example, have a tool called Carbon Designer, which I'll discuss during the 4th session, which allows you to get an estimation of the emissions of your building with only filling in very basic information, like perhaps your building area, the type of building you're doing, and the life cycle you're looking at. In concept stage design, we have much more options already. We, for example, have plugins for Rhino, Grasshopper, SketchUp, Tekla Structural Designer, and the further you go, the more plugins we also have. So we have Autodesk Revit plugins for pretty much any version. We have Tekla plugins, we have IES, Design Builder, so those are energy modeling softwares, and then there's a couple other options which come after that. So yeah, we offer tools for every phase of the project as well. So normally building LCA, you might do this at the concept stage or design phase, but you can do it at any stage really. So in strategy phase, we already have a tool called Site Designer, where you can look at the emissions of building in a specific site. So maybe you pick one site over another if the emissions would say so. In concept phase design, we have, for example, Carbon Designer, which we'll talk about. We have in the design phase a different type of integrations we can work with. For the build phase, we have a lot of EPD data. So if you're doing a project and you know what kind of materials you're going to buy, and these have EPDs, you can find those in our database. When you have actually built the building and you have really detailed LCA, you can simply send this to our cloud. And we can process this quite easily and give you the results in a matter of minutes. And if you have done everything, you can also benchmark your results versus validated projects in our Carbon Heroes program, which is something we'll talk about later as well. For our clients, we offer support throughout the entire time. So where a normal software provider might only help with the software, so how to use it, we do a bit more than that. So we also help with data selection or certifications or anything like this. So we have a quite good customer support team who normally always gets back to clients within a day. We have a help center which has about 200 articles where you can find anything about the software features or certifications or background information. It's all there. You can also access the help center quite easy from our software, and you can also get there from our main website. So yeah, database-wise, we are the biggest. We have by far the most data. On average, we add about 250 data points every week by our data team. So that is quite a lot. What kind of tools do we have? Kind of a recap of what we did earlier. What we'll talk about during this summer school are our building LCA tools and a Carbon Designer. Aside from that, we also have the product carbon tools and EPG generator, but they are for another time. So we'll really be talking or focusing about the building studies and carbon studies. Also, it is much easier to understand if there are some nice graphs, of course. So we have a variety of different graphs in our software, which allows you to interpret the results or make them more understandable to people who haven't really heard about building LCA. So yeah, different type of graphs will be accounted or introduced to them throughout the software training. So then we have the first section of today, climate change and the environmental impact of construction. So I assume that most of you are somewhat familiar with this, but basically if we are staying on the current rate of climate actions, there will be far too many emissions. Current already done carbon emissions, as you see, would get us to about 70 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. With the new agreed actions, will still rise to about 55 to 60, which is of course far too much. When there was a survey among CEOs and compared year on year, the effects of climate change are becoming much, much more worrying. I mean, if you have checked the news like in the last week, you've probably seen this as well. Environmental damage is becoming quite a problem in the world. If we want to be able to stop climate change, we have to basically keep the reduction to maximum 1.5% or 1.5 degrees, which basically means we have to do another 35 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions, which are not implemented yet, which is a major number. Globally, of course, we cannot deal with any type of global warming emissions, but 39% of the global carbon emissions are coming from the construction industry. So that is something where we can actually do something about. 11% of this is coming from materials which are used in construction, and 28% is coming from the operational emissions. So quite a big number. And we as building LCA specialists can actually do something about this. As cities are kind of expected to double by 260, this means that there will be about 230 gigatons more of embodied carbon coming directly from construction materials. Part of this would be new construction of buildings. Part of this would be renovation and demolition of buildings. And also quite a major part of this will be from infrastructure. What this basically means is 6 years of energy emissions or driving around Neptune's orbit in a car 52 times, which is massive, or basically building a New York City every month until 2060. And New York City is pretty big. The World GBC has also noticed that we have to do something about it. So we have to cut embodied carbon. And that's what we're mostly going to be learning about. All construction should become operationally carbon neutral, and we should be able to cut 40% less embodied carbon by 2030. That's what the World GBC says. So where do we actually get these climate impacts from? If we're looking at the normal assessment, in this case, 6th-floor building with a cellar, 2,500 square meters for a 50-year lifetime, we can see that a very big part of this comes from energy consumption. So that, of course, you can do something about by, for example, having renewable energy. But as you see, we also have quite a large part coming from the construction materials manufacturing, from the construction itself, from repairs, and then also some from demolition. When we are looking at the emissions over time, and this is a graph from one of the projects done in our software, we can see that over the 60-year period, there is a lot of emissions in the beginning. So that's basically at year 0, when our building is constructed, we have a lot of emissions. So a quite big peak. But we see over those years that there's also a lot of emissions adding up every year. And that can add up to about 60% of the emissions if you take a look at the operational carbon. If we actually switch to renewable energy, you can see that it lowers at least the emissions of energy by quite a bit. So almost 50% over the entire 60-year life cycle. But of course, the A1 to A3 emissions, the emissions of our materials that we're using for construction, cannot really do anything about that at this point. So that is something we're looking to change. In the future, when the energy sector has kind of like decarbonized, so we're using mostly renewables, the dominant source of CO2 emissions will be materials. So of course, we can then look at energy efficiency, cleaner production to reduce more of these emissions. And in some of the countries, like in Sweden and Norway, we can already see that over a 50-year life cycle, the material emissions will exceed the operational emissions. So basically, if we're looking at the whole life cycle of construction sustainability, in 1970s, we started looking at more energy efficient solutions. Around 1990, we started looking at decarbonizing energy. So switching to solar panels, PV panels, wind energy, things like this. Then around 2010, we started looking more at embodied carbon. So how do we reduce our material emissions? Or maybe by using more sustainable materials, these kind of things. And then around 2018, we started to look really at carbon management. So how are we going to manage our carbon to basically make sure that we reduce that 39% of global emissions for the construction industry? When we are looking at an entire stage in predefine or pre-stage or pre-design, we can already define certain specifications. And at this point, as we haven't actually built anything, this gives us a quite good position to actually make influences on the construction without having too high costs. So in the graph you see here also, the ability to influence in pre-design is quite high, which comes at quite low cost of changes. When we're in the design phase, when we are trying to make sure that our buildings are designed better, more environmentally friendly, we can still do quite a lot, but there will already be cost incurred here as well. Basically, any change we make to our building design will cost. When we are actually doing the construction, there isn't that much we can change anymore. We cannot just simply say after the building is ready, half made, okay, we want to change the structure. We want to change from concrete to wood. If we do it, there will be very high costs, so almost impossible. And then when we're in the use phase, at this point, changing anything will have very little effect and will have very high costs. So as early as possible to do this better for everybody, basically. There is currently an increasing demand for carbon neutral building. So maybe those who are familiar with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, there's a couple of cities, or actually quite a lot, which have joined this alliance to basically make sure that their city is carbon neutral at a certain point. For example, Oslo strives to be before 2050 already carbon neutral. Stockholm goes for a fossil-free solution by 2040. And there's a lot of cities who have pledged to this or making changes. In Finland itself, we, for example, have the biggest construction company, Ute, who has said that they will halve the emissions of CO2, which they emit by 2030. So quite an optimistic goal. There's some other companies who have also said similar things, that they cut, for example, the carbon emissions among the entire value chain by 50%. There are some countries which are a bit more leading in this. For example, in Norway, we have certifications which are doing this. In Netherlands, it's mandatory to do assessments for buildings which are over a certain size. And in Sweden and France, we have regulation, which is also becoming mandatory. There are a lot of different certifications and schemes around the world. All look at things in a slightly different way. If we take a look at what is actually regulation, then we can see that most of this is, for example, in Northern Europe, continental Europe, and North and South America. But there are also other options. We, for example, have standards around the world. We have guidelines, we have certifications, and we have regulation. While certifications are great, they are usually optional. So you don't necessarily have to do them. But if we have regulations, then people have to do building LCA, or they have to do carbon studies. When we take a look at the biggest ones around the world, for example, BREEAM and LEED, these are sometimes demanded by, for example, investors, that they have to have these kind of LCA studies done before the building is actually constructed. In Finland, we'll have the YM method, which will become mandatory. And in France, we have the Energy Carbone and the RE 2020. In Norway, it's also mandated by Statsbygg, one of the governmental real estate organizations, to do assessments for NS 3720, the Norwegian standard. So what kind of legislations and standards are there? So life cycle assessment always gives us the big picture. So we can do a life cycle assessment study or a carbon study if we just want to look at global warming potential, for example. We can also do life cycle costing, and we can also combine these. So when we're doing life cycle assessment, we're looking at the emissions of an asset or a building over a certain time frame. From life cycle point of view, this is usually 60 years. Life cycle costing, we can do the same. So we could also do a cost image over the 60 years, but we can also do optimization for just shorter periods or looking at certain elements. When you do either a life cycle assessment study or a life cycle cost study, this doesn't always have to be for a full building. A lot of people think if they do an LCA, it has to be for everything. It really depends on what you're trying to do. So we can do this for certifications, which usually have a set scope. So we might have to do only mandatory elements like the structure and the envelope, or we could do everything, kind of depends what we're looking at. When we then take a look at the emissions, there's a lot of emissions coming from the material manufacturing, so our A1 to A3. There's some emissions coming from the construction, and of course, we might also have some emissions from the replacement of materials. Like if we're building a building, we put in windows and doors, these will not last 60 years, for example. They might have to be replaced after 20 or 30 years. During the use phase of the building, we're of course also emitting emissions. So we might have energy cost, heating cost, all these kind of things. And then of course, we also have demolition emissions at the end of this life cycle. So the emissions for taking down the building, recycling the materials, etc. When we are looking at life cycle assessment, how do we actually do this? How do we calculate this? So there are different ways of doing this. And usually this is done through a characterization method. More of this will also be in the next session, but basically the characterization which is mentioned here is the CML characterization. So we are looking at different types of emission groups. So we of course have global warming potential. Everybody knows this, kilograms of CO2 equivalent. But we also have acidification, eutrophication, ozone depletion potential, abiotic depletion, all these kind of things. Then we can of course also look from a cost image. We can look at what it actually costs to do this. We can look at how much energy is required for this and all these kind of things. We can use different type of environmental impacts to measure basically the same methods. So as we see also here, aside from global warming potential, we have also the ozone depletion potential, which describes the damage caused to the ozone layer, acidification, which basically looks at the soil and water and how this decreases the nutritional availability for plants and animals. We have eutrophication, so nutrient emissions, and we have, of course, also the depletion of fossil fuels, which is the use of non-renewable resources in an unsustainable way. So general principles of life cycle assessment. We can do an LCA in a lot of different types of scopes, but basically if we're doing product LCA, so we're recording the emissions of a product, this is always cradle to gate. When we're doing normal LCA, the natural scope is always cradle to grave. So they basically start with our material emissions until the building when it's deconstructed. When we do LCA, we use an attributional approach. So basically we assign responsibility using allocation methodology and avoid the use of system expansion. We can also use LCA to identify weak points in operations. We can use it to compare different types of solutions, and we can heavily use it to influence decision making. If we're doing LCA in business, we usually have to follow standards like the ISO and EN standards. This is usually common in national methodologies, like in Finland in the YM method or RE 2020. When we are doing LCA, what can we actually do? We can, of course, do LCA to achieve certain credits. So you could have a mall and the real estate investors who are actually investing in this mall to say, okay, this mall has to reach LEED Platinum, which is certification. We can also use LCA to make choices between designs or materials. So we could be comparing different type of buildings, like a brick building versus a concrete block building or a wooden building, and basically see what is better from an environmental point of view and from a cost point of view. We can also use it to raise awareness. So if we are open in what we are calculating, this shows people we are actually trying to make the world a better place. It can also be for regulating life cycle or material emissions in projects. So in some countries, there are certain values which they have set. Like in the Netherlands, we have a system called MPG. And if you do an assessment, you cannot go over a certain value, otherwise you don't get your permit to build. You can also do awards, so competition-based prizes. So let's say we're building a building block here. There will be 4 or 5 construction companies who are all submitting a design, and it has to meet certain requirements for them to actually get a permit to build there. This can also be used for building and planning permissions in LCA, which kind of follows a similar thing as above there. There are different types of structures for accounting principles and standards. We have, as a start, the ISO standards. So the ISO 14040 and 14044 are the basics for life cycle assessment. And then there are some other sustainability indicators. More familiar in Europe are the EN standards, which were basically made to encompass more than the basic ISO standards. The most important standards here are the EN 15978, which are for building LCA calculations. And then we have the EN 15804, which are important for product LCA. So when manufacturers basically want to record the emissions of their products. We also have national regulations, and there, of course, are voluntary schemes. One of the biggest examples here would be, of course, the voluntary schemes of BREEAM and LEED. We have the European levels framework, which quite recently left the pilot. In Finland, we have certain frameworks, and then, of course, there can be a variety of different types of things. So when we are basically looking at what are we calculating, there is a uniform way to make a life cycle, which is based on CEN TC 350. For building LCA, we have the standard EN 15978, as I said, and then for product level, we have 15804. When we look at the different life cycle stages, we always start with A1 to A3. So these are the emissions of making our materials. So the raw material supply, transport, and the manufacturing of this. Then we have, of course, the construction process. So the transport of the materials from wherever factory is made until we're actually building our building. Then the emissions for actually building the buildings, any emissions which happen during the construction process. And then we have use phase emissions. So these are any emissions which happen during the years or period that our building is operationally used. So this could be energy emissions, water emissions, repair, refurbishment, replacement, anything like this. Then we have end of life emissions, so C1 to C4. So this is related to deconstructing our building, transporting the waste of this building towards our waste processing facilities, or disposing of it, which is of course not that great, but it also still happens. And then we have D phase. D phase is kind of separate from this. Those are the potential benefits we get from reuse, recycling, or recovery. The minimum, as I said here, would always be the A1 to A3. Under the current EN 15804, this is the only thing which is required. We'll cover more about EPDs in the next sessions, but A1 to A3 is always the most important. What we are actually recording depends a lot on what you're trying to do. So there could be schemes like in Sweden where they are only looking at A1 to 3 and maybe A4 to 5. In Finland, they might do A1 to D. LEED does A1 to C4. So it very much depends on what you're actively engaged in from certification point of view or calculation point of view. There are some requirements for doing your LCA. So we have to set a service life. So what kind of period are we looking at for a calculation? Any materials that don't meet the service life, they will have to be replaced or refurbished. So if we have a building, an office building of 60 years, and we have some doors that we buy, and our manufacturer tells us this door will last 30 years, they will have to be replaced at year 30. So there will be some material emissions for the replacement. We have to clearly document the functional requirements. So if we are doing an office building, we have to get materials which would suit for an office building. We cannot suddenly turn it into a parking garage or something like this. Construction products can only really be compared at a building level. So we cannot really make comparisons without taking into account the building context. And one product might require more maintenance than another, depending, of course, on what we're choosing here. We're not allowed to do forecasting of potential future impacts or improvements, because, of course, we don't really have any effect on this. We might not be allowed to do this in 30 years or whatnot, and we cannot use LCA using market-based green electricity, because it's just not possible to guarantee. So the business case for building sustainability. We can use this for different types of stages. So we can steer emissions through different stages. If we're doing building LCA carbon studies, it's always best to start with this as early as possible. So the best way would be to do it in strategy phase, whereas I showed earlier, any changes you make have very high benefits and very low costs. After that, it becomes much more difficult. But we do have options on the OneClickLCA platform. So as I said, in concept phase, we could, for example, use Carbon Designer. In design phase, you can export very accurately your data and get an overview of the emissions. In construction phase, we can use actual emissions. And of course, in as-built phase, you could compare it against validated projects in our Carbon Heroes benchmark program. When we are doing really early phase baseline, and this is the tool called Carbon Designer, you can get quite quick an idea of what the possible emissions for your building are based on very basic information. And with our Carbon Designer tool, this would be just your project size, let's say 2,500 square meters, our project type, we could say it's an office building, and maybe some geometry information. After that, we just check the results. We get an idea, okay, this building has X emissions, and we can continue from that. So that we'll cover during the fourth session. What we can also do, instead of building new buildings, we can renovate buildings. It actually could be a lot cheaper. It could be better from an environmental point of view. And you might be able to retain those iconic structures we already have in our cities. Other materials which we do not replace, they can be considered as recycled. So we could, for example, have the structure of a building. We leave that. We only change the envelope or something like this. And then, of course, the emissions could be quite lower. We calculate energy efficiency always with future energy emissions. In the UK, for example, they're using these decarbonization scenarios, which account for the fact that if we're building our building now, 60 years from now, we're not going to have the same emissions for our energy usage. We can also make efficient use of spaces by counting, for example, the numbers of users or the hours a building is operating. As you see in the graph here also, if we're doing a new construction project versus renovation, the renovation being on the left, we can see that there's quite a lot lower amount of emissions throughout the use phase. So materials have to be replaced less often. What is also done quite often in LCA is competitions or land sales. So there's a couple of examples I have listed here, which are all have all happened in Finland. So we, for example, had in Porvoo, we had an apartment block which was made, and basically the plot sales composition was linked to how environmentally friendly or climate friendly the building was that they were going to be building. And at that moment when they did that, I think it was 2018, it was the most climate friendly residential building of its time. Then we, for example, have the Tampere Talo Hotel, where there was a design competition in 2 different steps. They had to submit multiple designs. And the idea was that they could only build if they would show a carbon reduction of at least 25%. Then there were some Finnish schools in the design competition where they had to reduce the carbon emission structures by at least 50%. And then there were also some social welfare building renovations where they had to reduce the carbon by at least 35%. So when, for example, this example of this the school project they did, the carbon footprint of materials had to be according to the EN 15804. So we were only looking at the material emissions. We're not looking at the operational energy use. And as we saw that the emissions were almost twice different in the entire carbon footprint. So we can see that there are different designs which were done here. And we can see that the design on the right had almost twice as much material emissions as the design that was on the left. And in this case, they recorded the emissions per kilogram CO2 per square meter per year, which is a common way of reporting the emissions in Finland. So when we're in technical stage design, we have different type of tools to automate our design process as well. So shortly covered this earlier, but if we're looking at how can we get data towards OneClickLCA or towards an LCA assessment for speeding up our process, we can do this in different type of ways. We can do this, for example, from energy design. So different type of energy softwares like Design Builder, either ICE or IES, where you can basically design your building and you get an output of what kind of energy emissions you would have for a year or for a certain period. That kind of data you can export to OneClickLCA, which gives you already all the materials of the building, and it also gives you your energy emissions, so the operational carbon. You can also do this with design softwares like Revit, Tekla, ArchiCAD, or any of the others we support. You can also do it through files. It's quite common that if you do an LCA, you only have a cost plan that you upload in Excel. So you might have a bill of information or a bill of materials which you upload, or Excel or GBXML, and you can start your assessment from those. And of course, there are different types of BIM management softwares like Solibri or Simple BIM, which are quite similar to Revit, but usually have slightly bit less functionality. So there are more to check the existing models. BIM is building information model, by the way. So you know what we have in the model before we start doing an actual LCA on this. Of course, very common is to do a carbon footprint or LCA in certifications. And as we covered this already before, LEED and BREEAM are very popular ones around the world. If you check later on the link, which is there below, or you navigate to our website and you search for case studies, you'll find these different types of case studies which have been done with our software, which have reached certain goals. So for example, in the UK, one of our clients did an assessment for the new Bloomberg headquarters, which at that moment was the world's most sustainable office building. We have some studies for LEED Platinum, for example, in the US, but there's different options throughout Europe. And LEED Platinum is basically the highest rating you can get in LEED. And then we also have some quite big projects like a shopping center in Finland or the airport in Helsinki, which have been done also with our software. We can also combine lifecycle assessment and lifecycle costing to basically find the most optimal solution from an environmental point of view, but also from a cost point of view. In this example, there were different type of companies who were competing against each other for a permit to build. And in this case, you can see the dot and the X, they were actually from the same construction company. So there was one company who first made a design which was quite high in emissions and quite high in cost. They changed their design and that actually became the most sustainable per square meter per year, and also the lowest in costs, so from a monetary point of view. We can also do LCA in procurement stage. So in our database, which you'll see later, there's a lot of data available. So basically, we can look at the different type of concretes, like in this example, and try to find out from environmental product declarations, what are the lowest options from an environmental point of view. All the data in our software is benchmarked against each other, and I'll come back to that in the next session. But basically, if you access a certain product group, like all the structural steels, all the cements, or the concretes, windows, doors, doesn't really matter. We can compare them next to each other to find out what is the best solution from an environmental point of view. That does not always mean that it's the most cost-friendly, but it allows you to do planning throughout the purchasing stage quite well. What we can also do is infrastructure projects. As I showed all the way in the beginning, quite a big part of this 260 gigatons of emissions, which will happen if we double cities, will be from infrastructure. There are also schemes in infrastructure we can do, even though we won't cover them in depth throughout this summer school. They can also be quite important. Infrastructure assessments use pretty much the same assessment method. Of course, certifications might have different names, but they look at the same lifecycle stages. And instead of doing an LCA for a building, you could be doing an LCA for a bridge, water treatment facility, an airport. It doesn't really matter. They all use quite the same materials, but they use the materials maybe at different stages, or they use it to build different things. Then we have now a homework assignment, and then there's a bit longer Q&A session. I think I ended a bit early, but that's not really a big problem. So the homework sessions, as I say here, we're not going to check them because we have quite a lot of attendees, but we do recommend to do that. For the simple reason that if you attend this summer school and you soak up all the information we're trying to give you here, it will be quite good to complement with what you're learning here. So any type of research you do, maybe you won't understand it right now, but then in the next session when we're talking about certain legislations or standards, you'll make the connections, and it all makes quite a lot of sense. So the homework for session 1 would be to research and document detailed requirements of local or regional standards. So if you're in a country, check what is required for building LCA or carbon studies there. So in the UK, you'll probably stumble up BREEAM UK or GLA or RICS. In France, you find RE 2020. And around the world, there's all different types of certifications. So if you're interested in this, I could also recommend to check out the embodied carbon review, where we have basically already done this kind of comparison study with each other. But usually you'll find quite a lot of local data. How we can actually get access to OneClickLCA. So the access to the software and the free training license, it will be given in the 3rd session. So that will be on Wednesday. The reason for that is on Wednesday will be the actual software training. So we'll really talk to you about why are you using OneClickLCA? How do we start projects? How do we use the different features? How do you find data? So we'll give that access on Wednesday. Before this, I do recommend to already register your account. So there was an email that was sent out probably last week. So if you go to our website, oneclicklca.com, try to log in there. You can register there as well. But you can also see the link underneath here. So that is oneclicklcaapp.com/app/register. So just make sure that you register your account. After you register, you'll get an email which asks you to activate it. And if activated, you'll be able to access OneClickLCA. If you want, you can start a trial in the meanwhile. Trials are free to start, but the access to the actual software license will be given on Wednesday. So now I'll have time to answer a bit more questions live. So I'm not sure. I see some Q&A here already. And I see that my moderators have already answered 24 questions as well. Thank you very much. So let's see. Well, then I'll take this question from Berkay. will there be anything related to BREEAM NOR in the session for Scandinavian countries? So BREEAM NOR is quite similar to the Norwegian standard, NS 3720, but it, from a certain point of view, is also more related to BREEAM International. So the BREEAM International tool we have can also be used for BREEAM Norway. So basically, if you know how to do BREEAM Norway, and you've also attended a session in the Nordics where we'll be discussing the NS 3720 standard, you'll pretty much know everything you need to know. Then we have a question from Dylan Webb. What is usually the limit on building size beyond which assessment is usually required or suggested? There is not really any limit. If you want to do an assessment for a single-story building or a skyscraper, like the sky is the limit, you can do whatever you want. But of course, the bigger the building, the more materials you'll need, the more different type of construction methods there will be. So bigger buildings usually mean bigger assessments, which require more accurate and more detailed information. So I hope that that answers your question. We have a question here about A1 to C4. Can you please repeat the A1 to C4 divisions? So when we're doing life cycle assessment, we start with the A1 to A3. So the A1 to A3 is our construction materials. So the harvesting of the raw materials, the transport to the material, the factory where we're going to be building our product, and then of course the making of this material. Then we'll have A4, and A4 will be the transport of wherever the factory is that we have made the material until where we are going to be building our building. That's A4. Then we have A5, which are any emissions which happen during the construction process. So these could be emissions relating to machinery that we are using outside, fuel that we're using, energy that we're using, temporary materials like formwork. Then we'll have different type of use phase emissions. So B1 to B7. B7, our B1 is use phase, for example, concrete carbonization, vegetation carbon withdrawals, HVAC emissions, this kind of stuff. B2 and B3 are the repair rate and the maintenance emissions. So this could be any materials which have to be maintained or repaired. B4 would be replacements, so actual replacements of materials. So a door would be replaced at 30 years or anything like this. B5 is refurbishment, but from an LCA point of view, usually B4 and B5 are combined because it just makes more sense and they kind of get the same type of emissions. Then B6 is operational energy. So any type of energy we use, electricity, heating, fuels throughout the service life of our building. B7 is operational water. In Norway, you have B8, which is operational transport, but this is not included to most certification schemes. And then we'll have C1 to C4. So C1 is our demolition of our building. C2 is the transport of the materials to the recycling or disposal facilities. C3 is the recycling of our materials. And C4 is then the disposal of materials. And then, of course, we have D phase, which is kind of after that. I think I already answered this question. Then we have a question here from Natalie Douglas. Similar to a question above, does OneClickLCA take the embodied carbon of MEP systems in account? Is there a way for the new TM65 methodology to get integrated into your LCA calculation processes, or do we have another system or methodology to account for this? So MEP, which is basically mechanical and electrical, are also called building services. You can account for it, but it's not mandatory in a lot of schemes. So for example, in the UK, which is probably where you're from, since you're talking about TM65, in the UK, in GLA or RICS, or sometimes even in BREEAM UK, when you do the newest, 2018, you have to account for MEP. There is quite a lot of MEP data in the software, but MEP is one of those tricky things because manufacturers of lamps, HVAC systems, elevators, they're not required to publish data for the products because usually there are other considerations why they do it. So in TM65, they give you a methodology on how you can calculate it, for example, using raw materials, which are also in our software, but there are also data for it. So nowadays, it's already a much better position where you can find quite a lot of data for MEP already just in the database. So for example, if you search for a heating system, you find something in square meters, same with cooling, same for electrical wiring and whatnot. So there are options already. On our help center, there's also an article. How do you include building services or MEP? So you could probably search that and you get the answer there as well. I have a question on the cost of the software. Really depends on what you're trying to buy. So I cannot really say that. But basically, we have 3 tiers. We have starter, business, and expert. The starter would be around 700 euros, I guess. Business about 1,600, and expert about 3,000. But it very much depends on what you're doing. So if you really want to know the cost, it's better to actually contact one of our business developers who can tell you exactly what it costs. Is there any, I have a question from Raul here. Is there any specific content for data centers that we'll cover in this training? We don't really have any specific content for data centers, but data center is a type of building that you can do an assessment for. So of course, the building size or the building structure of a data center can be quite different, and it will be very heavy on the type of MEP, so the servers and whatnot. Servers is something there is not a lot of data for, so that might be a bit tricky. But I mean, it can be used as any type of LCA, basically. I have a question from Daya. How much would an academic license cost? So if you're looking for a license for your thesis, so either bachelor or master, you can get a free license. You can just go to our website. There's a link for requesting a free license for students, and you can just give us the information about your topics, and if it matches what we offer, it'll just be free. If you're looking for a license for academic costs, for example, for teaching or for research, this is always 50% cost of a commercial license. In those cases, I would also recommend to contact the local business developers. Question from Thomas. I already got the student license. Do I need a license on Wednesday? The student license is quite similar to what we're offering in the free license here, but there is a different tool. There are 2 different calculation tools. So I would say when you get the key, just activate a project and see what is the difference there. Most of the homework assignments you can also do with a student license already. The question from an anonymous attendee: who is OneClickLCA competitor for this type of software? So if you check the slides of this presentation tomorrow, there was one slide which also listed different type of competitors. So you can just check that slide. There's quite a lot of people quite a lot of companies who offer this type of software, but there's none that really do it like us. Like, we really connect every part of the construction sustainability sphere. Where can I find the calendar of the sessions? On our website, if you just go to Google and you type OneClickLCA Summer School, probably the first link also has a calendar of all the sessions when they are. But basically, it's every day at 4 p.m. Helsinki time. Of course, not in the weekend, but weekdays. There's a question from Alejandro. Do you have any particular consideration with certified materials? For example, cradle-to-cradle certification? Not really sure what you exactly mean there. Like, a lot of the materials, they will not have D-stage data, so you cannot really do cradle-to-cradle. But under the new EN 15804A2 amendment, there will be this kind of data, but it's not really relevant right now. So in the next session tomorrow, we'll also talk about the different life cycle stages, and we'll also talk specifically about D-stage. So I assume your question will actually answer there. So most of our data does have D-stage emissions, but I will explain tomorrow how we do that. A question from Marika. We'll be going through how to create a good estimate for existing buildings as well as newer projects. In a sense, you can use Carbon Designer for that. It's a tool I'll cover in session 4, but existing buildings can be quite tricky because the data you're using is usually accurate data, which is relevant right now. And existing buildings might have been built 40, 50 years ago, depending on what kind of life cycle scope you're looking at. 40 years ago, the construction methods were very different. Construction materials were very different. They were not as sustainable. The energy use was not as sustainable. So doing an LCA for buildings done a long time ago can be quite tricky. You'll need to find very accurate data on what they have used back then, which usually isn't really available, which is quite tricky. There's an anonymous question. This course seems to be very important for people who have experience in the industry. So can you recommend any resource so that people can get an overview for different codes and standards? We have a building LCA, what is this called again? White paper on our website. I recommend to read that. Especially on the support center, there's also a section on background information. So you can also get an overview of the different codes and standards which are relevant there. If you go to our website and you check the type of certifications we support, you'll also be getting an overview of all the different type of certifications we support. Question from Pedro, cradle to cradle is a possible term when considering circular economy. Yeah, so the license will actually also include a building circularity tool where you can look at the circularity of all the materials in your building. So there you'll also be looking at the end of life process. So what happens with the materials after deconstruction? And cradle to cradle indeed just means A1 to D basically. So the D phase, which is the benefits to the building, end up with materials which you can recycle, which you can then use for A1 to A3 assessments for the new building. Good question from Benjamin. Is OneClickLCA software useful for desalination and water treatment projects? I would say the infrastructure version of OneClickLCA is. I would not use the building version for this. But the infrastructure I won't really cover too much throughout this session. The recording will be shared with everybody tomorrow. So there you will get access to one space where we gather all the recordings. There is a question from Unikrishnan. Increasing, we use a lot of renewable energies, heat pumps, etc. in houses, so the operational LCA won't be complete without them. True. Do we have data for PV and other technologies? We do indeed. But when you're looking at the embodied carbon, you're only looking at the emissions of the materials itself. So we will be looking at the emissions of making the PV panels, and those options are available in the database. And of course, the operational side is a different query. It's the operational energy, so B6. Somebody just joined. How is the lecture ending now? I think there was an issue with the time which was listed on the website, which was basically listed as an hour later than it actually started. So we'll have the recording available tomorrow morning, so you can always check it back then. So another question was when it will be available. Basically tomorrow morning when I get to work, I'll upload it. Will the class provide case studies that help prove the value of LCA? So there's a lot of case studies on our website which talk about these kind of things, which you can look at. We discussed a couple of things today also. So throughout the class, you're of course free to ask us whatever you want. So if you want to know anything about why LCA is important, just ask us and we'll help you. The summer school is mainly supposed to be educational. So we're trying to teach you about building LCA, why it's important, how you do it. And of course, case studies will help with that. anonymous question about time difference and how you can access the Zoom recordings. So the recording will be shared tomorrow. How can you download the software? The software is cloud-based, so there's no download needed. What time should I be attending if I'm from India? I recommend you check any type of time zone converter and just check what time 4 p.m. Helsinki time, so in Finland, would be for your time zone. Then there's a question from Maria. What is the best way to calculate LCA for reuse components? It means they have several cycles of life. How can it be taken into account? So if you have materials which are reused, which are including in a current LCA, basically the A1 to A3 emissions would already have been accounted to in the previous life cycle of the building. So basically, if another building was there before which had these materials, they will have those emissions. So there's a checkbox in our software, which is literally called reuse. And basically, if you account for that, you still account for the emissions of these materials to be replaced, but you do not account for the initial A1 to A3 and A5 emissions. And you can also remove the A4 emissions. If you're on our support center and you check or you search for reuse materials or salvage materials, reclaimed materials, you'll find an article which explains this as well. This functionality will also be available in the LCA tool that will be available to you. So you'll be able to see it, and I'll also cover it in the training tomorrow. All right, guys, there's quite a lot of questions. I'm just trying to answer them as they go. There's some more questions about why the session is 1 hour ahead. It's because we put the wrong time on the website. I'm so sorry about that. But basically, if you have just joined now, tomorrow and any further sessions, just join 1 hour earlier, or just check what in your time zone correlates to 4 p.m. Finland time, Helsinki time. I thought we had sent out another email with the correct time, so my apologies for that. Then there's a question from Tanaya. Do we consider LCA only for building construction materials, or is it for all materials that are incorporated in the building? Very much depends on what you're trying to do. If we're doing the traditional normal building LCA, we indeed do pretty much only building materials, so construction materials. But there's a lot of schemes nowadays, for example, in GLA, where they also include interiors or fittings. So they might actually also include all the furniture, all the electrical, etc. So very much depends on what you're trying to calculate. Then we have a question from an anonymous attendee. So the most contributing carbon factor in materials is from concrete, steel, and energy. Pretty much, yeah. I would say the biggest group is always the structural materials. So if you have a steel building, it will be steel. If you have a concrete building, it will be concrete. And energy, operational energy, can be a very large factor. But all the building services can also be a very, very big emitter. MEP, as it's called, or building services, are usually not included to LCA studies yet. BREEAM is kind of different in that, because in BREEAM you can include it and you get more points for it, but that can actually also be about 40 to 50% of the emissions. A good report to read there is the TM65. It's a report published a couple of months ago in the UK, which talks about the importance of MEP emissions. Are there any open source software for LCA? Depends what you want to do. We offer, of course, OneClickLCA Planetary, which is a free version of our software, which has the 10 most contributing materials there, which you can do assessment with. There is a free student version we offer. So if you're looking at getting software for doing your bachelor or master thesis, you can apply for a free license as well. I already have an account from a course I did with the Irish GBC. Will this work for this course, as I can't register using the same email? You can just use your existing OneClickLCA account, because the license we give you right now will be with a license key. So basically, you just start a project, you fill in the license key, and it activates just that project. Dana Farr asks, what kind of solutions do you have for early design stages? Carbon Designer, I would say. Carbon Designer is for really, really early design stages. If you're looking at site solutions, we have a tool called Site Designer, which doesn't look at the building, but it really looks at the building site. Anonymous attendee says that I feel I still couldn't take a good grasp on so many terms mentioned in this session. Will they all be clarified and explained in the coming sessions? Yes. The next session will be talking mostly about terminology. And in the third session, we'll be talking about the software itself. So anything you had today that you don't really understand, probably you'll understand about tomorrow. And then in the third session, where you actually look at the software, you'll basically see what this terminology means inside our software. Somebody said they have a question with the account activation. If you have a problem with account activation, I would say just send an email to our support team and we'll get back to you on that. I cannot really say it from here. And there's a question from Abdullah. So are we getting a license similar to the expert license for the summer school? Yeah. So in the third session, I'll also explain what is exactly included, but it's kind of a mix of business and expert features. So we cannot give all the expert features because some of them work in a way that doesn't really work with educational license, but it will be a mix. So you'll be able to do all the exports, you'll be able to see all the fancy graphs, access all the benchmarks. So we'll be able to do quite a bit. Thank you for sharing that link for World Time Buddy. It's indeed a good link to check. David asked if there's a calculation method for water consumption for evaporation cooling. There are some calculation methods which give you water assumptions, but there is none that we have available in the software. So these are usually external tools which you can use for that. Another question from David, can you help to measure the software and site's environmental impacts? If you mean the software, if you can measure the impact of our software, I'm not really sure. In GHG reporting, you can measure the emissions of emails, of software, of websites, but GHG reporting is quite different from building LCA. In this summer school, we really talk about building LCA. So it is possible, but not with what we're offering right now. Then we have a question from Purusharsh. Apologies if I don't pronounce it correct. What regulations do apply to countries ultimately when they have continental or national regulations, like France with Europe would follow what regulations exactly? Is completely up to the countries. So of course, most countries that have signed these Paris Accords, they have to get a certain reduction by a certain period, for example, by 2030, but it's up to them on how they get this reduction. So in Europe, we of course have the levels framework, which can be followed, but usually every country has also their national scheme. Like France has RE 2020, which will become mandatory. In France, in the UK, you have RICS and you have GLA. GLA is, for example, Greater London Authority. So if you do any construction in London, you have to do an assessment. In Finland, we have YM method. In the Nordics, you have different type of schemes. So this will all be covered, I think, during session 8, where I'll give you an overview of all the different type of certifications which are relevant around the world and what you can basically do to meet them. And of course, those optional sessions, optional session 11 to 14, they will also talk about some of these schemes. Andrea asked if this course will include lifecycle cost analysis tools. I have not included that in this course, but if you are a student, you can ask for a student license, which includes lifecycle costing tools. Nicole said that she joined late because of the time consumption. What time tomorrow we're recording posted? Early morning finish time. So let's say over 12 hours from now, give or take. Dylan asks, has OneClickLCA been used for projects in the Caribbean region? Yes, it has, by some of our clients. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention them, but has indeed been done. Caribbean region projects are a bit tricky because you have to ship in a lot of materials. So actually the biggest group of emissions from projects in the Caribbean region are transport and not usually your materials, which can be quite difficult because you cannot really do anything about that. Gonchalo asked, hope I pronounce it correct, the storage of electricity when coupled with a renewable production system will be considered in the LCA. You can include the storage of electricity if you include this with the MEP parts or the building services. But finding accurate data on storage facilities can be quite tricky because it's not a common thing to include in an LCA assessment. Nina asked whether the LCC part also includes cost externalities. You can include a lot of different things to LCC parts. I would recommend to check on our customer help center, an article on LCC, and see what you can actually include there. For lifecycle costing, it very much depends on what you're trying to do. So if you're doing, for example, this for BREEAM credits, there's a lot of things you have to include there, mandatory elements, which would also be external costs. Somebody asked if it's possible to show subtitles along the video session. I have no idea. I'm not sure if it's possible. If there are some questions if there's some parts you haven't understood, just send us an email. I will try to get back to you on that. A question from Praveen, does OneClickLCA software has been used in the Middle East, especially for EPDs? If yes, local data sets are available for Middle East. Yeah, there are EPDs for the Middle East for products there. So you can use them. If you search for any of the Middle Eastern countries, you'll probably find some EPDs for them. Of course, the majority of EPDs in the world are made or are released for Europe and North America. So if you do any type of projects in those countries, you'll find a lot of data. In the Middle East, you also have some data, but not as much. And of course, any projects in the Middle East might also fly in materials. So then you actually might be using data from other countries, but then you just have flown this material in. Question from Subarna, does OneClickLCA or is OneClickLCA able to acquire information directly from the BIM model? Yes, it depends on what you have in the BIM model, of course. This will be covered more in depth during session 7, where we look at different types of BIM integrations and what kind of data is there. If you go to our customer help center and look for, if you just type BIM model, you'll find 2 articles which talk about what kind of data has to be in a BIM model at what stage and how you can use this in OneClickLCA. So that might also be useful to check. A question from Sarika, is it for lead certification? You can use OneClickLCA also for lead certification. There's a lot of our clients who do that. It's one of the most common certifications in the world. Question, can you please tell me if this software is useful for the assessment of neighborhood scale multiple buildings? You can use the software for that, of course, but traditionally from a building LCA point of view, you do an assessment for one building. You can, of course, use it also for city planning, but it's not as common to do it nowadays still. So maybe that could be more for infrastructure projects, or you just have to do multiple building LCA assessments. That's possible also. Question from Anonymous, will construction material LCA also be taught within OneClickLCA? So in our session 5, we'll be specifically talking about the most commonly used construction materials, but we will not talk about product LCA. So we won't teach you how to do an LCA for 1 cubic meter of concrete or 1 door or something like this. So this session is really focused on building LCA and carbon studies. Thomas asks if by completing the homework, should it be good for the test or do we need further research or work? If you complete your homework and you attend the sessions or you watch the recordings, you should have all the information for the test. Avinash is asking if we are planning to expand our solution beyond the construction field. While we might in the future, this is currently not really planned. Like trying to do everything is not really effective. Trying to do one thing very effective, trying to be very good at one thing is usually much more effective. And the construction sector is responsible for 39% of global carbon emissions, so it's quite a lot. So I think if we tackle this field very good, we can do already much more than most softwares can do. Anna asked if this software is useful for anaerobic digestion system. I have no idea what that means. I'm so sorry. If you send us an email, I can take a look at that. If you're not around for the exam on the Friday, I would recommend you send us an email and we can see what we can do for you. Tendai asks if do we get accredited with LCA, for example, BREEAM? No, not specifically for BREEAM. So BREEAM itself, they offer courses to get accredited, which you have to take through the BRE Academy. This course mainly tries to teach you how to do building LCA using our software. So basically teach you on all these standards, requirements, how you can do it effectively with our software. So kind of you get like accredited with being a building LCA professional using OneClickLCA. I have a question from Uni Krisham. While carrying out an LCA for, say, non-standard materials not in the database, could we just add all the materials separately? Yes, indeed. If you have a specific material which you know is made up of certain raw materials, you can just find those raw materials and group them and use it that way. There is quite a lot of non-standard materials available in the database, of course, but if they are very, very exotic materials, then there might not be so many options for them. There is a question from an anonymous attendee. What input databases are needed by LCA users for analyzing building carbon embodied in circularity? Depends. Like if you're trying to do an assessment in the UK, probably you want to have at least UK data. But there's a lot of data in Europe, which is very good for using. We integrate basically every publicly available EPD database in the world. So if you're doing an assessment somewhere, there's usually a lot of relevant data. So you can just check when you have the license, what is there. We'll be covering more about EPDs and the type of data later also. Leonard asks if we're going to be discussing different scopes. So the tools we'll be giving you access to are the Levels Carbon and the Levels LCA tool, the Building Circularity tool, and the Carbon Designer. So we'll talk about those. When we do the session overview of the different certification schemes, which is I think session 8, we'll be talking about different scopes as well. And during session 10 to 14, they'll basically deep dive into certain certifications. So in one session, they'll talk specifically about the UK schemes, one about LEED and BREEAM International, one about the Nordic schemes, and then we have one about the French schemes. Dana asked if we can consider embodied impacts from another building, if elements from another building are reused. Yes, you can. There's a checkbox in our software for using or accounting for reused or reclaimed materials. We'll cover that in the software training on Wednesday. Carolina asked if the exam can be taken on a different day. It is a live exam, but if there are enough people that cannot make it to that exam, we can look at having it on another day or another time as well. So just please reach out to us and we'll see if we can do something about that. Is a student license sufficient for summer school learning exercises and exams? I would say it is, but the tool we offer throughout this course is different from the student one. So it's a bit more advanced, so it has more indicators it reports on. So if you want to learn, I would use the summer school one. Then a question from Malcolm: which professions perform life cycle assessment? Is it engineers, architects themselves, people working in construction industry, or consultants? It very much depends, but our majority groups of clients are architects, engineers, and green building consultants. But anybody can do LCAs. There is really a trend in companies who used to outsource LCAs who are now doing it themselves. So anybody can learn it. It's not rocket science. Deirdre asked if we are going to cover how to link it with CAD softwares. During session 7, we'll talk about integrations, and ArchiCAD integration is one of them. Shreya asked if, other than building, what other products can be analyzed using OneClickLCA. Well, this session will talk, or like this summer school, will talk about building LCA and carbon studies, but we do also have product LCA solutions. But our product LCA software is not a generalist software. So while you can use it for anything, it's really specific for construction products. So if you want to do concrete, steel, plastic pipes, heating systems, anything in the realm of construction, that's where our product LCA software specializes in. A lot of questions, guys. We're getting to them. There's just a lot of them. Are there any necessities for uncertainty analysis in LCA and building? And if yes, has OpenLCA uncertainty? I don't know about OpenLCA. I don't use that software myself, so I don't really know. We do have material uncertainty, which is the metadata methodology from Carbon Leadership Forum, which is regarding the materials itself. If you want to know about uncertainty, you can also check on our customer help center on how you can compare or actually compare data that you're using. It's a quite useful thing. You can never really rule out uncertainty between the data you're using for building LCA. There is a question from Zoa Hype. Do the emissions or resources consumed materials used during the construction phase can also be accounted for in OneClickLCA? Yes. So these emissions are related to the construction site operations, which is A5. So any energy, fuel, temporary structures you can all account for in the construction site operations phase, which is one of the parts in the tools you'll be getting access to. So I'll be covering that in the software training. Dana asked what LCI database is used in OneClickLCA. So for our product LCA, we use EchoInvent. When we are using building LCA, we are using already characterized LCI data. So the main LCI databases used by manufacturers who record the emissions for their products are either EchoInvent or Gabi. There are, of course, some others. So yeah, the data you're accessing in a building LCA tool is not LCI data. It's already characterized data. So LCIA data. There's a question if we are able to get access to the presentation material before the session starts. I think our marketing team will only give access to the folders where we upload the data, so the files and the materials tomorrow. So from tomorrow, it will be possible, I think. There's a question if embodied carbon in OneClickLCA software is similar with global warming 100 or global warming 100, excluding biogenic. Depends on what you're trying to calculate. So in our software, under the current EN 15804A1, we separate biogenic. So you have it separated in the result page, which will make more sense tomorrow and the day after. Probably you will have the answer to the question then. A question from Jay, does the software provide an estimate of indirect emissions depending on the country and or energy sources? Not really sure what type of indirect emissions you mean in this case. If there would be indirect emissions or in the production process of materials, you'll already be included in the A1 to A3 of the EPD or product you're using. Then Anna asked a question about what type of LCA should be done for comparison of, well, basically different end of life methods. So the materials we have in our database will have different end of life methods available to them. So if you have, let's say, a quantity of 100 cubic meters of wood, you could do one which follows incineration as the end of life method. You could do one which follows landfilling. And if there are some other options, you could probably compare those as well. It's possible. To clarify the homework, yes, Alistair, that is correct. So basically, I don't know where you're from, but just check what are kind of local or regional standards regarding LCA and regulations or EPDs near you. Maybe don't do the EPD part because that will actually be part of another homework. So just check what kind of local and regional standards regarding building LCA there are. Rosanna asked where we can find the recording. It will be sent to you by email, where you will get access to the public drive folder where it will have all the recordings. A question if we have an example exam. We do not, but if you do the homework assignments and you check either you attend these sessions or you check the recordings, you'll be prepared more than well enough. And of course, if you access OneClickLCA when you should. Question if LCA follows the ISO 14004. It follows ISO 14040 and ISO 4044, which is basically equivalent to the EN 15978. Not sure what this 14004 is. Naija asked if we will consider lead requirements. There is a specific session on lead. It will be session 12. Where we cover really in-depth lead requirements. Asfand is asking if model D with cutoff crediting Pentamal with the software, you'll be able to calculate module D in our software. So the tool you'll get access to, the levels carbon and levels lifecycle assessment tools, they will have the option to record D. And D is always external, so it's not included to the totals, but it is recorded. Yazid asks if this is the link to the MEP article. It is indeed. So there's a couple ways you can record MEP. So you could, for example, just find the closest match, apply scaling, and include the raw materials, those kind of things you can do. There's a question from Mark, is LCA for parametric design available in OneClickLCA, or do you have to import every single parametric variant and then do an LCA? You can do parametric design in Rhino or Grasshopper. So you do it in those softwares before you export the data to watch OneClickLCA. So when you are in OneClickLCA, you basically have already done the assessment before. So parametric really has to be done beforehand. I mean, you can do every single variant in the software, but it will take quite a lot of time. Purnima asked where she can find the recorded videos and PowerPoints. You'll get a link tomorrow, which will have it. Hashem asked if we have to submit the homework. No, you don't. There's over 800 signups to this course. So I really don't have the time to check every part of the homework. So I just recommend to do it because it really complements what you're learning here. Can you recommend where we can find product LCAs? So we have some guides on the website and the software where we talk about product LCAs, and we had a session a couple months ago about product LCA, and there might be another summer school session later about product LCA, but this one will really focus on building LCA. An anonymous question, other than LCA of buildings, what other product LCAs can be done with OneClickLCA? I mean, you can do whatever you want. Any type of product you can calculate with our software, but our product LCA elements, like our product LCA modules, are really focused on construction materials. So they are specialized for that. So if you want to do anything else, it's possible because you have access to the entire Equipment database there. But yeah. We indeed have a homework assignment for today. Maybe I can switch the PowerPoint to that one. So I hope you can see this now. So it's research and document detailed requirements of local and regional standards. Anonymous question, does Southeast Asia also do LCA for their project? What field is it demanded, or is it only demanded in developed countries? LCA in Asia is definitely not at the same level it is in Europe or in North America, but it is upcoming. So we have quite a lot of clients in Asia who start to do this. Mostly it's for BREEAM and LEED, but there are also some local regulations developing right now. So it might be more in the future. For example, in Vietnam, you have the Lotus. In Singapore, there is local schemes. In China, there's local schemes. So there are definitely options. The only problem with Asia is that there is not a lot of data yet, because manufacturers are definitely not required to publish data there. Anonymous question, what if the house is made of trees or traditional style using bamboo, which mostly exists in tourism industry? Can we analyze this? Yes. We have a lot of organic materials, and we also have bamboo. Bamboo compared to softwood or hardwood lumber or timber is not as common to have EPDs for, but there are enough options that you could do an LCA with it. So once you have access, just search for bamboo and you'll find all the resources you need. Will there be an opportunity to connect with the students in this class? I haven't really thought about that, but we could create like a LinkedIn group or something where you can discuss it. I have to look into this tomorrow. If there are people that will be interested in it, we can definitely set it up. Can you repeat what you just said about characterized LCA data? So maybe I'll just link you one article which explains this also. Give me 1 second. So I answered the question there. An anonymous entity asked if we also address well criteria. Not at the moment. There's not a lot of requests for well criteria at the moment. Anonymous question, can we use your software to analyze prefab residential house versus traditional build? Definitely you can. There's a lot of our clients who are doing just that. For example, the prefab modules are made in different countries and they're shipped over and they compare it to traditional build. So yeah, you can definitely do that. Yasid is asking if EPDs of building services are available. If yes, are they a lot? EPDs for building service or MEP are definitely available, but compared to traditional construction materials, there are not that many. Because usually if companies buy building services like HVAC equipment or whatnot, they don't really do it from an environmental point of view. They do it from a cost image or effectiveness of this type of equipment. So there is data, but not as much as traditional construction materials. And that's just a problem worldwide. It's not just our software. Anonymous question, do you have databases associated with facades? I'm not aware of a specific facade database, but we have a ton of facade materials available. So anything you want, different type of materials, you can do assessment for it. Question from Umara, for the decommissioning phase, which countries' regional or environmental disposal recycling practice are being adopted of? So when we look at decommissioning, so end of life emissions, we basically look at the material subtype. So if you have a CLT element, it usually follows very certain end of life processes. If you have concrete, it might be recycled, it might be downgraded to aggregate, of course, dependent if it's precast or ready mix. So we don't necessarily take a look at countries or regional things. We look at the most common end-of-life processes and give you those as options. So they will always have a default. For example, ready-mix concrete will be recycled to aggregate. Organic materials will be incinerated for energy recovery, but you can usually change those. Does the standard include alternative building materials such as earth, for example, earth excavated in situ and used in construction of walls? There might be some materials which include this, but that seems like a quite exotic thing. There is definitely earth available, a lot of different types. So you could make up your own assembly, which uses excavated in situ and use it for construction of walls. Yusuf asked, for existing building renovations, you mentioned that the kept parts are considered recycled in an LCA, but can we assess all the parts that cannot be kept to know and compare they're being replaced with better materials? I mean, you can do different type of designs options and compare one with reused materials and one with new options and check what is the difference. Like you can do different type of options or comparisons quite easily. Can we use OneClickLCA for assessing the environmental impact of solid waste management? Not really in a building LCA tool. That would be able to be done in, for example, process LCA or product LCA, potentially even, but not really in building LCA. Question from Fab. Do EPDs consider reduced GHG emission from production processes that use renewable energy sources? Is this accounted for in OneClickLCA calculations? If you have a product which is made with renewable energies, you will see it in the results of this EPD. So for example, if you compare steel, which is made in a blast furnace versus electric arc, they will have different type of emissions for sure. And of course, that is accounted for in an LCA, in building LCA, because the emissions of products is what you're including in your building LCA. You're finding all the products for this, for your whole building, and that ends up being your total score. So yeah, one good example is that, for example, Rusal, one of the biggest aluminum manufacturers, they have produced a new aluminum which is completely made with hydropower. That is a lot lower than traditional aluminum, lower in emissions, that is. Keith asked, does OneClickLCA use delivered energy or primary energy when inputting building energy use? We calculate the energy mixes based on consumption of countries from International Energy Agency. So they look at the consumption of a country worldwide, or let's say you have Sweden for 2019. You take a look at all the consumption data, and we use eco-event data to calculate these emissions. Asking about the homework, are you asking about the standards of construction or the LCA or of everything? Basically, just try to find and document requirements for local or regional building LCA standards. Maybe I forgot that part, sorry. Can your software help make the case for off-the-grid residential solutions within traditional zoning area? You could try to find that out with the site designer, but it's not a tool we have included here. Ankita asked if energy efficiency is calculated using future emissions. Is that not forecasting? In a sense, it is. So if we, for example, take the example of the GLA, the Greater London Authority, the scheme which you have to use in the UK if you want to build around London, they use forecasting scenarios. So they basically accounted from, let's say, 2040, or depending on what, that the emissions do not have, the energy emissions are basically carbon neutral. So that means that from an operational point of view, the emissions will be lower because you will not use as much energy emissions anymore. But any materials which will be replaced, let's say after 30 years, those materials which will be made 30 years from now in the future, they will use renewable energy to make those materials. So the replacement of those materials will also be lower in emissions. So basically, you would be using a decarbonization scenario. Joseph asked if the LCC part of our software involves calculating marginal costs. I would recommend you to check this one article. I'll link it. So lifecycle costing is done with a bunch of things we don't cover throughout this training. Just checking if we have it here. This probably will answer your question. So we are using different type of methodology to calculate lifecycle costing versus lifecycle assessment. If you want to know more, just send us an email and we'll get back to you about that. Jay asked if we cover LCA for data centers. LCA for data centers is basically just any type of building LCA. It's just a different type of building. It's not a normal building. Usually data centers are very large. They have a lot of space and there's a lot of servers inside them. But data center servers, there is not a lot of data for those, unfortunately. So the majority of emissions from a data center would actually be the technology which operates inside the data center. And that is a tricky part because there's not a lot available there. Tomaj asked, would we be able to learn about LCA as well as OneClickLCA software for circular design and buildings throughout the summer school? Yes, we have a building circularity tool, which will be available to you also. So basically, aside from looking at the emissions of your building, so the life cycle assessment part, you can also look at the circularity of the materials. I'll cover this throughout in the software training in the session on Wednesday. Yasid asked if we can tell about what the structure, arch, and building services embodied carbon percentages. Quite tricky. Structure is usually the biggest. Finishes can also be quite big, but it's never as big as the building services. I would say if you're joining on Wednesday and you're using Carbon Designer, you can see it yourself quite easily. Building services can be a very large part of the emissions. It can be up to 40 or 50%, but usually building services are left out of assessments. So for example, in BREEAM International, it's possible if you report on building services, you get more credits. And in BREEAM UK, you also get more credits if you do building services options. This summer school does not include life cycle costing, but we could look into doing a separate session on life cycle costing. Besides LCA, is it possible to evaluate material flow analysis of interior construction by building by OneClickLCA? Yeah, you could do a material flow analysis. So those were a lot of questions, 220 questions after this first session, a lot. Thank you all very much for attending so far. Tomorrow morning, you'll get a recording and you'll get also the slides. And then, of course, every weekday from now on until 14 days, there will be different type of sessions. One more question. My colleague who was registered at summer school was unable to attend. Is there any way to switch registered attendees? If you can send us an email, we'll send you a new link for registration, which will allow you to also be to get a certificate if you pass the exam. So please send an email to support. So yeah, I guess that was it for the first session. Thank you all very much for attending. I hope you have learned something. Probably it was still quite overwhelming because we haven't covered like the theory part yet, but we'll start with that tomorrow. Okay, I'll close the session now and process the recording and send it tomorrow. So see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.